We know the Vikings crossed the North Atlantic in open boats, established settlements in Greenland and Iceland, and survived winters that killed unprepared travelers within hours. We have their artifacts, tools, weapons, clothing excavated from frozen ground. We have their sagas, written centuries later, describing feats of endurance that seem impossible. But here's what we don't know: the precise techniques that allowed them to read weather patterns with enough accuracy to survive in environments where a single mistake meant death. The archaeological record shows us the what. The Norse texts give us fragments of the how. But between these sources lies a vast territory of lost knowledge, survival skills, so fundamental to Viking life that no one thought to write them down in detail. They were passed from parent to child, practiced daily, refined over generations, and when that chain of transmission broke, the knowledge vanished like breath in cold air. Consider this. A Viking farmer in 9th century Iceland could predict weather changes 12 to 24 hours in advance without instruments. We know this because their survival depended on it. Caught in the open during a sudden storm meant death by exposure in less than 3 hours. Yet these people not only survived, they thrived in conditions that would challenge modern mountaineers with Gore-Tex and GPS. How? The sagas mention men called ice readers, or weather knowers, individuals whose predictions were trusted enough that entire communities planned around their forecasts. One passage describes a weather knower examining the horizon, tasting the wind, and declaring that a storm would arrive between the 3rd and 4th hour after midnight. The storm came exactly as predicted. No barometer, no satellite data, just observation and something else, something we've lost. Modern meteorologists, even with supercomputers processing millions of data points, struggle to predict weather more than 7 to 10 days out with accuracy. Yet Vikings planned ocean voyages of weeks or months based on seasonal patterns they'd learned to read with extraordinary precision. They knew when the pack ice would break, when the storms would clear, when the fish would run. This knowledge wasn't superstition, it was empirical observation, accumulated over generations and tested against the harshest judge imaginable, survival itself. But deeper questions remain. What exactly were they observing? Weather prediction relies on reading subtle changes, shifts in cloud formations, changes in wind direction, variations in temperature and humidity. The Vikings had no instruments to measure these variables objectively. They used their senses, yes, but the human eye can't see barometric pressure. The skin can't detect the approach of a storm system still 12 hours away, unless they'd learned to recognize proxy indicators that we've forgotten how to see. Some clues survive in fragments. The Icelandic term vindata doesn't translate easily. It means something like wind direction, but implies a deeper relationship, an intimate knowledge of how different winds behave. The landnorther wind came from the northeast and brought clear, cold weather. The Utsuther from the south brought storms, but the texts describe 8, sometimes 16 different winds, each with distinct characteristics and predictive value. Modern Icelanders still recognize some of these terms, but the detailed knowledge which specific cloud formations accompanied, which winds, what those combinations predicted, has faded. Here's where it gets stranger. Archaeological evidence from Norse settlements shows they built their structures with extraordinary sensitivity to microclimate. Turf houses weren't just randomly positioned, they were oriented to capture maximum sunlight in winter, sheltered from prevailing winds, situated to avoid snowdrift accumulation. This suggests an understanding of how terrain shapes local weather patterns, how cold air pools in valleys, how wind accelerates through certain topographies. They were reading the landscape itself as a weather map. We've rediscovered some of this through computer modeling and meteorological science. We know now that terrain creates persistent weather patterns, that certain valleys always fill with fog, that specific hillsides always shed snow in predictable ways. The Vikings knew this too, without the models. They knew it so well they bet their lives on it every winter. But the question haunts: what else did they see that we're still missing? The answer might lie in something called deep pattern recognition, the human brain's ability to detect patterns in complex systems without consciously understanding the mechanism. Modern studies show that experienced meteorologists can predict weather changes by looking at clouds, sometimes outperforming their own computer models. They can't always explain why their prediction is different from the model's forecast, they just know. The Vikings might have developed this pattern recognition to a degree we can barely imagine because their lives depended on it in ways ours no longer do. Consider the havvilla, literally sea confusion, described in Norse texts. It refers to a specific weather condition at sea that disorients sailors, making navigation impossible. The descriptions match what we now call whiteout conditions, where overcast skies, fog, and calm seas create no visible horizon. Vikings avoided havvilla when possible, and had techniques for navigating through it when necessary. But those techniques referenced obliquely in sagas are never fully explained. We know they used solarstein, sunstones, possibly Iceland's spar crystals that can detect polarized light and locate the sun's position even through heavy cloud cover. Laboratory tests have proven this works, but that's only part of the solution. What else did they know? The ice itself held information the Vikings could read. The Greenland Norse could apparently predict the movement of pack ice with enough accuracy to plan seal hunts months in advance. They knew which bays would freeze first, which channels would remain navigable longest, where pressure ridges would form, creating barriers or bridges. This knowledge required understanding ocean currents, temperature patterns, seasonal variations, all without instruments, all through observation passed down through generations. Some of this knowledge survives in fragmented form among indigenous Arctic peoples who maintained continuous cultural transmission. Inuit hunters can predict ice conditions with remarkable accuracy, reading subtle changes in color, sound, even smell. When ice is about to break, it has a particular scent, the smell of the ocean water beneath. When it's safe to walk on, it makes certain sounds underfoot, produces specific patterns of cracks and flexion. The Vikings might have possessed similar knowledge, adapted to North Atlantic conditions, but we can't be certain because the chain broke. Here's what makes this loss particularly tantalizing. The Vikings succeeded where others failed catastrophically. Norse colonies in Greenland lasted nearly 500 years before environmental changes and cultural factors led to their abandonment. During that same period, other European attempts to settle in similar climates failed within months or years. The difference wasn't better ships or stronger warriors, it was knowledge. Knowledge of how to read the environment, how to work with extreme conditions rather than fighting them, how to predict and prepare rather than react and perish. The archaeological evidence shows adaptation on a level that suggests intimate environmental knowledge. Norse Greenlanders modified their diet dramatically, consuming up to 80% marine foods, seals, walrus, seabirds, despite coming from farming cultures. This wasn't just about food availability. It was about understanding the nutritional requirements for surviving in Arctic conditions. They somehow knew they needed the specific fats and vitamins these marine animals provided. Modern nutrition science has confirmed this. The traditional Norse Greenland diet, heavily weighted toward marine mammals, provided optimal nutrition for Arctic survival. But how did they figure this out without laboratories or controlled studies? The answer might lie in observation of Arctic animals and indigenous peoples, combined with trial and error over generations. But the sophistication of the results suggests systematic knowledge, not just lucky guessing. They developed techniques for rendering seal blubber into lamp oil that burned clean and smokeless, a technology that required precise understanding of temperatures and rendering processes. They created storage methods that preserved meat and fish through winter without refrigeration. They timed their hunts to coincide with optimal ice conditions and animal migrations, displaying ecological knowledge that would impress modern wildlife biologists. But we don't know exactly how they knew these things. The knowledge was practical, embedded in daily life, passed through demonstration rather than written instruction. When that transmission ended, the knowledge dispersed like smoke. We're left with artifacts and outcomes, the products of knowledge we can no longer fully reconstruct. Consider the Vetrinator winter nights, the period from mid-October to mid-March, when darkness dominated Norse territories above the Arctic Circle. During this time, communities relied on stored foods, careful rationing, and maintained social structures that prevented the isolation and psychological stress that destroys unprepared people. They had systems, social technologies as sophisticated as their physical tools for maintaining mental health during months of darkness. Saga descriptions suggest they used storytelling, games, crafts, and social rituals to structure time and maintain community cohesion. Modern psychology confirms that structured routine and social connection are essential for preventing seasonal affective disorder and isolation-related mental health crises. The Vikings knew this practically, if not theoretically, and built their culture around it. What we've discovered is only the beginning. Each archaeological excavation reveals new sophistication tools designed for specific micro-tasks. Clothing constructed with layering principles that modern outdoor gear manufacturers are just rediscovering. Dwelling designs that maximize heat retention while preventing condensation and mold. Every discovery suggests deeper knowledge, more refined technique, greater sophistication than we previously imagined. The human body can detect changes in barometric pressure. Some people feel joint pain before storms, others get headaches. The Vikings, living without shelter from weather, might have developed heightened sensitivity to these cues. Combined with observation of animal behavior, birds flying lower before storms, seals changing their patterns, before ice shifts, they might have constructed a complex predictive system based on multiple converging indicators. But the specifics, the systematic knowledge of which combination of signs meant what outcome, that knowledge exists now, only in fragments and educated guesses. Here's the deeper mystery. If we could resurrect this knowledge, what would it teach us about human cognitive capacity, about the limits of what direct observation and pattern recognition can achieve, about ways of knowing that don't require instruments but might be equally valid? The Vikings weren't superhuman, they were ordinary people who developed extraordinary skills because their survival demanded it, which suggests we might all carry latent capacities for environmental reading that our comfortable, instrumented modern lives have allowed to atrophy. The questions multiply. Did Vikings develop enhanced night vision during the dark months, the way indigenous Arctic peoples show adaptation to low light conditions? Did they have systematic knowledge of edible plants in winter, lichens and preserved greens that provided essential nutrients? What were the specific techniques they used to prevent frostbite during long ocean voyages? How did they determine when ice was thick enough to bear weight? Was it visual, acoustic, some combination? Each question opens onto others, a cascade of unknowns where we have outcomes without mechanisms, success without fully understanding the knowledge that enabled it. The most haunting aspect is how quickly comprehensive knowledge can vanish. Within 3 generations after Norse Greenland's abandonment, the detailed environmental knowledge that sustained 500 years of habitation was gone. People who could read ice and predict weather with life or death accuracy left no heirs to their expertise. The knowledge didn't just fade, it shattered, like ice breaking, leaving only fragments that hint at what was lost. What remains are questions that genuine expertise in archaeology, climatology, and traditional knowledge systems cannot yet fully answer. We know the Vikings survived. We know they succeeded where others failed. We know they passed this knowledge efficiently enough to sustain communities for centuries. But the transmission mechanisms, the teaching methods, the specific observational techniques, these remain partially obscured. like distant mountains glimpsed through clearing fog. The evidence suggests that what we've lost isn't just trivia or historical curiosity. It's comprehensive, environmental literacy, the kind of deep knowledge that modern science is only beginning to reconstruct through different means. The Vikings achieved through direct observation what we now approach through instruments and models. Both approaches have value. But recognizing what was lost means acknowledging that knowledge can take forms we've forgotten, that human capability extends further than we sometimes imagine, that understanding can be transmitted without being written, and that when such transmission breaks, we lose something irreplaceable. The ice that preserved Viking artifacts in frozen ground also preserves mysteries. Each thaw reveals new questions, each excavation opens new puzzles, and somewhere in the space between what we know and what we've forgotten lies a comprehensive survival system tested against the harshest environment humans regularly inhabited before modern technology. We see its outlines. We marvel at its results. But the full picture remains just beyond our grasp, like the horizon on a foggy morning, visible enough to know it's there, obscure enough to keep us guessing about what lies beyond. The Viking farmstead at Sturng in Iceland, buried by volcanic ash in 1104, preserved a moment in time with archaeological precision. Among the artifacts excavated from the frozen earth, fire-starting tools so refined that experts needed years to understand their full sophistication. A curved steel striker, worn smooth from thousands of uses, fragments of amadou fungus, processed and stored in a leather pouch, chunks of iron pyrite with specific fracture patterns. Together, these objects tell a story about relationship with fire that goes far beyond simply making sparks. We know Vikings could start fires in conditions that would defeat modern lighters in driving rain, howling wind, with frozen fingers and damp materials. Survival accounts from later Norse settlers describe starting fires during blizzards, on ice floes, in situations where failure meant death within hours. They didn't just know how to make fire, they had developed a comprehensive technology of fire creation, maintenance, and preservation that functioned reliably in the worst conditions Earth offers. But here's what the artifacts don't tell us: the timing. How long did it take a skilled Viking to go from no fire to sustained flame in freezing rain with high winds? What were the specific techniques for preparing tinder in advance, for keeping ember-catching materials dry during ocean crossings, for maintaining fire through multi-day storms? The archaeological record gives us the tools. The sagas mention the importance of fire-keeping. But the detailed methodology, the muscle memory, and practice technique that separated success from frozen death, that knowledge exists only in fragments. Modern survival experts attempting to replicate Viking fire-starting methods using authentic materials report success rates varying wildly depending on conditions. In calm, dry weather, experienced practitioners can achieve flame in under a minute. In wind and rain, the same experts sometimes fail after 20 minutes of effort. Yet Vikings relied on this technology absolutely, in conditions far worse than controlled experiments, which means they knew something we're still learning. The answer might lie in preparation as much as execution. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings carried multiple fire-starting kits distributed throughout their gear. Not one striker and tinder pouch, several, stored in different locations, some sealed in waterproof containers made from walrus intestine or fish bladders. This redundancy suggests hard-won wisdom. Fire-starting tools fail, get lost, become damaged. Success required backup systems, and more importantly, understanding of how to improvise when primary methods failed. Consider the tinder itself. Vikings used amadou fungus specifically, the middle layer of horsehoof fungus harvested from birch trees, processed by boiling in alkaline solution, pounded flat, and treated with nitra to enhance its ability to catch sparks. This processing required knowledge of chemistry that predated formal chemistry by centuries. They somehow discovered that boiling amadou in water, mixed with wood, ash changed its structure, making it more receptive to sparks. They learned that adding saltpeter created tinder that would smoulder for hours without flame, could be blown into fire when needed, and wouldn't be extinguished by casual moisture. Modern analysis shows this processed amadou is remarkably sophisticated. The alkaline treatment breaks down lignin, creating a material that's simultaneously fragile and durable. Fragile enough to catch the smallest spark, durable enough to maintain a smouldering coal through harsh handling. The niter treatment creates chemicals within the fungus that burn at lower temperatures than the surrounding material, effectively creating a fuse that can be lit and controlled. Vikings didn't understand combustion chemistry, but they understood results, and they refined their techniques over generations until they achieved something modern materials science struggles to improve upon. But amadou was just one option. Archaeological sites yield evidence of multiple tinder types: dried moss treated with resin, birch bark shavings stored in layers, dried lichen mixed with down feathers, even dried fish skin in coastal settlements. Each material had different properties, different ignition points, different burn rates, different resistance to moisture. The variety suggests systematic knowledge. Vikings knew which tinder worked best in which conditions, and carried appropriate options for the environment they'd encounter. Here's where it gets stranger. Some saga passages describe fire starting in conditions that seem impossible during ocean storms, for instance, when everything should be soaked. One passage describes a sailor starting fire in the shelter of his cloak, the tinder held against his body where warmth and breath kept it dry. This suggests techniques for maintaining microenvironments, for creating pockets of dry air and warm conditions, even when surrounded by cold and wet. Modern survival training teaches similar concepts, but Vikings developed these techniques through necessity, without theoretical framework, refining them until they worked reliably enough to stake lives on. The striker itself reveals sophistication easy to miss. Viking fire strikers weren't simple pieces of steel, they were carefully forged tools with specific geometries. The striking edge had to be hard enough to shave steel from the flint or pyrite, creating the shower of hot metal particles that ignited the tinder. Too soft, and the edge wouldn't produce adequate sparks. Too hard, and it became brittle, shattering with use. Vikings developed steel with carbon content precisely calibrated for fire starting around 0.8% carbon, the same composition modern knife makers use for striking tools. But beyond metallurgy, the striker's shape mattered. Curved strikers fit the hand naturally, allowing rapid striking motion with minimal effort. Some strikers show wear patterns suggesting ambidextrous use. Vikings practiced fire starting with both hands, ensuring they could create fire even if injured. The best strikers produced sparks with minimal force, critical when cold, weakened fingers couldn't grip strongly, or when starting fire while exhausted from rowing or travel. Archaeological evidence shows strikers were personal tools, often decorated, sometimes inherited. This suggests they weren't seen as simple equipment, but as valued possessions requiring care and maintenance. The best strikers were kept sharp through regular honing, stored carefully to prevent rust, treated with respect because life depended on them. Some were buried with their owners, considered important enough to accompany the dead into whatever came next. The pyrite iron sulfide used as spark-producing stone shows similar sophistication. Not all pyrite works equally well. Some contains too many impurities, some fractures incorrectly, some produces weak sparks. Vikings selected specific types, apparently by trial and testing, and transported it considerable distances. Pyrite from certain Norwegian deposits appears in Icelandic settlements, suggesting trade in fire-starting materials, or perhaps that experienced Vikings knew which sources produced superior stone and made efforts to acquire it. Flint served the same purpose but with different properties. Flint fractures with sharper edges than pyrite, creating more cutting action against the striker, potentially producing larger sparks. But flint also shatters more easily under hard strikes, requiring more controlled technique. Evidence suggests Vikings used both, selecting based on availability and possibly on personal preference developed through experience. The choice between pyrite and flint might have been like modern preferences between different types of fire starters. Both work, but experienced users develop opinions about which performs better in specific situations. But spark creation was only the beginning. The real skill lay in nursing that spark into flame. Modern attempts show this is where most failures occur. The spark catches the tinder, creating a glowing coal, but the coal dies before flame develops. Vikings had techniques for this critical transition, methods for shielding the developing ember from wind, for feeding it progressively larger fuel, for coaxing flame from smolder. Saga descriptions mention fire breathing, not literal breathing, but a technique of directing air onto the ember, controlling oxygen flow to encourage combustion without extinguishing the coal. The progression from spark to sustainable fire required prepared materials arranged in specific sequence. Finest tinder caught the spark, creating ember. Medium tinder, shaved wood, dried grass. Fine bark fed the ember, growing it larger and hotter. Kindling small twigs, wood splinters, resinous bark built the coal into flame. Small fuel sticks created the first fire, then progressively larger wood until the fire could sustain itself. This progression seems obvious in retrospect, but each step required materials prepared in advance, arranged for rapid use, protected from environmental conditions that would render them useless. Viking dwellings show evidence of sophisticated fire management, not just starting fires, but maintaining them through harsh conditions. The central hearth in Norse longhouses wasn't simply a fire pit, it was an engineered system for heat production, smoke management, and cooking. Archaeological evidence shows careful attention to draft control, to wood arrangement, to techniques for keeping fires burning overnight without consuming excessive fuel or creating dangerous conditions. Some hearths show evidence of fire that burned continuously for decades, maintained through careful feeding and banking, never completely extinguished. The knowledge of how to bank fires, reducing them to coals that could smolder for hours or even days, then be revived when needed, seems almost forgotten in modern firekeeping. Vikings understood that completely extinguishing and restarting fires wasted resources and effort. Better to maintain the fire in dormant state, feeding it minimally, preserving coals that could be blown back to flame when needed. This required understanding of oxygen flow, fuel density, and heat retention, practical physics learned through observation and passed through demonstration. Some Norse settlements in Greenland and Iceland show evidence of fire being transported rather than restarted. Travelers carried smoldering punk wood or treated fungus in horn containers, feeding it minimal oxygen, keeping the ember alive for days. When they reached destinations, they could blow this coal into flame far more easily than creating new fire from scratch. This technique, fire transport, requires intimate knowledge of combustion, of the balance between oxygen, fuel, and heat. Too much air and the coal burns out. Too little and it dies. Vikings apparently mastered this balance well enough to make fire portable. But deeper questions remain. How did Vikings start fires in extreme cold, when metal becomes so cold that touching it can cause instant frostbite? How did they manage fire starting with frozen fingers that couldn't grip properly or feel the subtle feedback that guides skilled striking? Saga descriptions suggest techniques for warming tools against the body before use, for protecting hands while maintaining dexterity, for working through cold that would incapacitate unprepared people. But the specific methods, the practiced motions and adaptive techniques exist now only as implications from success, not as documented instruction. Consider the challenge of fire starting during multi-day ocean crossings. Open boats offered no shelter from spray and rain. Everything became damp or wet. Yet accounts describe Vikings cooking on shipboard, preparing hot food during journeys lasting weeks. How? Waterproof containers protected the driest tinder. Knowledge of which materials could be dried quickly held near body heat. Exposed to wind allowed recovery of dampened supplies. Techniques for creating fire in small sheltered spaces, possibly using soapstone boxes as portable hearths, enabled cooking despite hostile conditions. But the complete system, the full methodology that made this possible, remains partially obscured. The sophistication extends beyond mere technique to ecological knowledge. Vikings knew which trees produced best firewood, which burned hottest, which created least smoke, which coals lasted longest. They understood that driftwood, dried by sun and salt, burned differently than fresh-cut timber. They knew bogwood, preserved for centuries in peat, required different handling than standing dead trees. This knowledge wasn't academic. It determined survival when fuel choices meant the difference between adequate heat and freezing. Some woods were preferred for specific purposes. Birch bark, rich in resin, served as emergency tinder, even when damp. It could be shaved into curls that ignited from sparks even in rain. Juniper created hot, long-lasting coals ideal for overnight fires. Willow and alder, common in Iceland, burned fast and hot, good for quick cooking fires but poor for sustained heat. Pine produced resin-rich kindling but created dangerous creosote buildup in chimneys. Vikings apparently understood these properties through observation and shared this knowledge as essential survival information. Archaeological analysis of hearth ash reveals surprising sophistication in fuel management. Layers show strategic mixing, resinous wood for quick heat, dense hardwood for sustained burning, combinations calibrated for specific needs. This wasn't random burning. It was engineered combustion, as carefully planned as modern heating systems, but achieved through empirical knowledge rather than thermodynamic calculations. The results worked reliably enough to sustain communities through winters that lasted 7 to 8 months. But the question haunts: what happened when fire starting failed? When the steel striker broke? When all tinder became soaked? When pyrite was lost? Saga references hint at emergency techniques, friction, fire methods using bow drills or hand drills, though these are mentioned only obliquely. Archaeological evidence for such tools exists but remains ambiguous. Were these backup systems, or has interpretation overreached? We know Vikings carried multiple fire-starting kits, suggesting they planned for failure. But the complete emergency protocol, the backup methods that ensured fire even when primary systems failed, that knowledge exists more in inference than documentation. The psychological dimension cannot be ignored. Fire starting wasn't just physical skill, it was mental preparation, confidence, born from practice, the certainty that one could create fire when needed. Vikings began learning firecraft in childhood, practicing until the motions became automatic, until success was expected rather than hoped for. This psychological foundation, the unshakable belief that fire could be made, might have been as important as physical technique. Panic causes fumbling, hesitation, failure. Confidence enables smooth motion, proper technique, success even under stress. Modern survival psychology recognizes that skills must be practiced until they function under extreme stress, until they can be executed while exhausted, frightened, hypothermic. Vikings didn't have formal survival psychology, but they had something perhaps more effective: cultural transmission of knowledge considered so essential that failure to learn it properly marked one as incompetent or dangerous. Fire starting wasn't optional skill, it was fundamental competence, and communities ensured everyone mastered it, because everyone's survival might depend on anyone's ability to create flame. What we've recovered through archaeology and experimental replication is impressive. We can make Viking fire-starting tools, process amadu according to traditional methods, achieve flame using authentic techniques. But replication in controlled conditions differs from execution, while exhausted, frozen, in darkness, with death approaching if fire cannot be made. The Vikings lived in that reality, and their fire-starting knowledge reflected it. They didn't just know how to make fire, they knew how to guarantee fire, even when everything conspired against success. The questions multiply faster than answers. Did Vikings develop standardized training methods for firecraft? How did they teach children the subtle wrist motion that produces optimal sparks? What were the common mistakes, and how were they corrected? How long did mastery typically require? Each question opens onto others, creating a cascade of unknowns where we see outcomes without fully understanding the knowledge systems that produced them. Here's the deepest mystery: comprehensive. Knowledge of fire starting, refined over centuries, transmitted across generations, tested against the harshest conditions, largely vanished within a few generations after traditional methods became obsolete. The introduction of matches and modern fire starters seemed like simple progress, easier, more reliable, more convenient. But in adopting them, entire bodies of knowledge atrophied. We gained convenience and lost understanding, traded reliability for simplicity, and only now recognize what disappeared. What remains are fragments, tools in museums, mentions in texts, successful experimental reconstructions, pointing toward comprehensive mastery we can approximate but not fully reclaim. The Vikings' relationship with fire was intimate, essential, refined through necessity into something approaching art. They could create flame where we would fail, maintain fire through conditions that would defeat us, and did so with tools that seem primitive only to those who haven't tried using them in earnest. Somewhere, in the space between artifact and accomplishment, lies knowledge worth recovering, techniques worth remembering, and questions that remind us how much can be lost when transmission breaks. In 1879, excavators working near Þjórsárvöllur Valley in Iceland uncovered a Viking-age farmstead that had been perfectly preserved under volcanic ash for nearly 800 years. The structure, they revealed a turf longhouse, measuring roughly 90 feet by 20 feet, demonstrated engineering sophistication that puzzled researchers for decades. The walls, constructed from layers of turf stacked between wooden frames, measured nearly 6 feet thick. The roof, supported by driftwood beams scavenged from beaches, curved slightly to shed snow. But the true genius lay in details that wouldn't be fully understood until modern thermal imaging and architectural analysis revealed what the Vikings had known through observation and experimentation. We know these structures kept people alive through winters, where outdoor temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius with wind chills far lower. We know they accomplished this burning remarkably little fuel. Archaeological analysis of ash layers suggests daily wood consumption, far below what simple physics would predict necessary. And we know the occupants didn't just survive, but maintained enough comfort to work, socialize, and preserve mental health through months of darkness. But how the architecture achieved this, the specific principles and techniques that made it work, exists partially in archaeological record, partially in informed speculation, and partially in mysteries we're still unraveling. The turf itself functioned as sophisticated insulation, but not in ways modern materials scientists initially assumed. Early theories suggested turf worked simply through thickness, 6 feet of earth, providing massive thermal mass that resisted temperature change. True enough, but incomplete. Modern analysis reveals the turf walls contained microscopic air pockets created by grass roots and organic material, essentially creating a natural version of foam insulation. The layering technique, alternating turf cut from meadows with turf cut from peat bogs, created zones with different insulating properties, apparently selected based on position in the wall structure. But here's what researchers couldn't explain for decades. Why turf walls sometimes performed better than modern insulated walls of similar thickness. Computer modeling suggested the ancient structures should have been colder, damper, less comfortable than they apparently were. Viking longhouses should have been barely habitable, yet evidence shows they functioned well enough that people lived in them for generations, raising families, maintaining health, thriving rather than merely enduring. The answer emerged slowly, through careful analysis of how these structures managed moisture. Moisture destroys insulation. Wet insulation loses most of its thermal resistance, and damp interiors breed mold that sickens inhabitants. Modern buildings manage this through vapor barriers and mechanical ventilation. The Vikings had neither, yet their structures remained remarkably dry despite being built from organic materials in wet climates. They'd somehow discovered principles of moisture management that modern architects rediscovered only through building science research in the late 20th century. The secret lay in layering and breathability. Turf walls didn't just insulate, they allowed controlled moisture migration from inside to outside while preventing bulk water intrusion from outside to inside. The outer turf layers, cut from meadow grass, formed a dense mat that shed rain like thatch. Middle layers, containing more organic material, provided insulation. Inner layers, carefully selected and positioned, allowed water vapor from cooking, breathing, and body heat to migrate outwards slowly enough that it wouldn't condense inside the wall, but fast enough that it wouldn't accumulate in living spaces. This hygroscopic design materials that can absorb and release moisture without losing function took modern engineers decades to rediscover. The Vikings apparently understood it practically, if not theoretically, and built their entire architectural system around it. But the specific knowledge of which turf types went where, how thick each layer should be, how to recognize proper versus improper moisture behavior, that detailed understanding vanished with the master builders who created these structures. The longhouse design itself reveals sophisticated understanding of heat distribution and airflow. The central hearth, positioned precisely in the middle of the main hall, created convection currents that circulated warmth throughout the structure. But the positioning wasn't arbitrary. Archaeological evidence shows hearths were located at specific distances from walls, apparently calculated to maximize radiation heating without creating dangerous fire hazards. Some hearths show evidence of stone arrangements that directed heat preferentially towards sleeping areas, suggesting intentional engineering of thermal zones within the structure. Sleeping benches running along the walls weren't just furniture, they were part of the thermal system. Raised 18 to 24 inches above the floor, these benches positioned sleepers in the warmest air layer, cold air, being denser, pooled at floor level. Warm air from the hearth rose and spread along the ceiling, before cooling and descending along the walls. The benches intercepted this descending warm air, creating sleeping zones that stayed significantly warmer than floor level. Simple physics, but the Vikings understood it well enough to engineer their living spaces around it. But deeper mysteries remain in the details. Some longhouses show evidence of what appear to be intentional air channels under the floor spaces that might have created convective loops, drawing cold air from floor level back toward the hearth for reheating. Whether this was intentional design or fortunate accident remains debated. Archaeological evidence is ambiguous. The channels exist, but their purpose isn't documented in any surviving text. We can measure their thermal effect using modern instrumentation, but we can't know with certainty whether Vikings understood and planned for these effects, or simply stumbled upon a design that worked better than they realized. The entrance passages, long, narrow tunnels leading from outside to the main hall, demonstrate clear understanding of cold air management. These weren't just simple doorways, but thermal airlocks that prevented cold air from rushing directly into living spaces when the door opened. Some entrance passages curved or angled, further disrupting cold airflow. The most sophisticated examples included intermediate chambers, where people could remove outdoor clothing before entering the main hall, preventing snow and ice from being tracked into living areas. Window design, or rather the general absence of windows, reflects harsh necessity. Glass didn't exist for most of Viking Age, and any opening large enough to admit light would also admit catastrophic cold. Some structures show evidence of translucent membranes, scraped fish bladders, or seal intestines stretched across small openings, providing minimal light while maintaining insulation. But mostly, Viking winter life occurred in dimness, lit by hearth fires and oil lamps, another adaptation to climate that affected everything from daily rhythms to social interaction. The roofs present their own engineering puzzles. Turf roofs, standard across Norse settlements, provided excellent insulation, but presented serious structural challenges. Turf is heavy. A full coverage turf roof might weigh 20 to 30 tons. Supporting this weight required substantial timber framing, but Iceland and Greenland had limited wood. Vikings used every scrap of driftwood they could find, supplemented with whatever timber they could import or salvage. Some roof beams show evidence of being repurposed ship timbers, suggesting how desperately they needed structural wood. But weight wasn't the only challenge. Turf roofs need specific slope angles to shed water without eroding. Too steep and the turf slides off. Too shallow and water pools, rotting the structure. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings understood these limits, engineering roofs with slopes apparently calibrated for their turf composition and local precipitation patterns. But the calculations, how they determined proper angles without modern math, remain mysterious. Trial and error over generations probably played a role, but some structures show sophisticated engineering that suggests deeper understanding. The most puzzling aspect involves how these roofs handled snow load. In some Norse territories, winter snow accumulation could exceed 10 feet. Added to the existing roof weight, this should have caused catastrophic collapses. Yet structural failures appear rare in the archaeological record. Did Vikings somehow engineer their roof frames to handle these loads? Did they actively clear snow? And if so, how did they know how much accumulation the structure could bear? Or did the roof design naturally shed snow through some mechanism we haven't fully understood? Some researchers suggest the slight curve in many roof designs wasn't aesthetic, but functional curved roofs shed snow more readily than flat ones, and the curve might have been calibrated to encourage sliding at specific accumulation thresholds. But this remains speculative. We can observe the curves, measure their geometry, model their structural properties. We cannot definitively know whether Vikings intentionally engineered these features or arrived at them through incremental refinement of designs that worked without fully understanding why. Interior space organization reveals cultural values encoded in architecture. The high seat, the place of honor, where the household head sat, occupied a specific position relative to hearth and door, apparently chosen for optimal temperature and ability to oversee the entire hall. Sleeping arrangements reflected social hierarchy, with higher status individuals occupying warmer positions closer to the hearth. But this wasn't just social preference, it was survival strategy. The elderly, children, and sick needed warmth most and received priority positioning. The young and healthy could tolerate cooler sleeping positions farther from the fire. Storage areas for food and equipment showed similar thermal engineering. Root cellars dug into the ground beneath living areas maintained temperatures just above freezing, cold enough to preserve food but warm enough to prevent destructive freezing. These weren't simple holes but carefully constructed chambers with drainage to prevent flooding and ventilation to prevent spoilage. Some show evidence of ice storage, winter ice cut and buried in insulated pits, providing refrigeration into summer months. The techniques for maintaining these ice stores through seasonal temperature changes involved knowledge of insulation, drainage, and air circulation that we can reconstruct but might not fully understand. Archaeological evidence from Greenland Norse settlements reveals even more sophisticated cold climate architecture. Structures there incorporated additional insulation layers, smaller interior spaces to minimize heating requirements, and more complex entrance systems to manage extreme cold. Some Greenland longhouses show evidence of what might be heated floors, stone slabs positioned over channels that carried warm air from hearths, creating a radiant heating effect. Whether this was intentional design or beneficial accident remains uncertain. The mystery deepens when examining how Vikings maintained indoor air quality. Burning fires in enclosed spaces creates deadly carbon monoxide and depletes oxygen. Modern buildings manage this with mechanical ventilation and chimney systems. Viking longhouses had smoke holes in the roof, but these were small, large openings would have vented heat catastrophically. Yet inhabitants apparently avoided carbon monoxide poisoning and maintained breathable air. How? Careful analysis suggests the turf walls themselves might have provided sufficient air exchange. The breathable wall structure allowed enough air infiltration to maintain livable conditions without creating drafts that would have made the space uncomfortable. But this requires remarkably precise balance. Too much air exchange and the structure becomes too cold. Too little, and occupants suffocate or die from carbon monoxide. Vikings apparently achieved this balance reliably enough to live in these structures for centuries, but the specific design, principles that ensured proper ventilation remain partially mysterious. Some researchers propose Vikings actively managed ventilation by adjusting smoke hole covers or opening and closing doors at specific times, maintaining air quality through conscious intervention rather than passive design. Saga references to airing out dwellings support this theory, but detailed descriptions of when and how this was done don't survive. We're left inferring practices from outcomes people survived in these structures, therefore they must have solved ventilation problems, but the specific solutions remain incompletely documented. The social dimension of cold weather architecture cannot be separated from the physical. Longhouses weren't just shelters but social spaces, where extended families or multiple households lived in close proximity through long, dark winters. The architecture had to support social interaction, provide some degree of privacy, and prevent the psychological stress that destroys groups forced into prolonged close contact. The layout of sleeping benches, the positioning of work areas, the organization of storage spaces, all these reflected not just practical needs but social engineering as sophisticated as the thermal engineering. Modern psychology recognizes that physical environment profoundly affects mental health and social dynamics. Poorly designed shared spaces create conflict, isolation, depression. Well-designed spaces facilitate cooperation, maintain individual dignity within group living, and support mental health through challenging conditions. Vikings apparently understood this intuitively, creating architectural solutions that sustained community cohesion through conditions that would shatter unprepared groups. But the specific design choices that achieved this, why certain spatial arrangements worked better than others, exist, more in successful outcomes than documented principles. Consider the challenge of maintaining hygiene in structures that couldn't be easily cleaned during winter. Dirt floors, limited water, close quarters conditions that should breed disease. Yet archaeological evidence suggests Vikings maintained relatively good health through winters. They must have had practices for managing waste, controlling vermin, maintaining cleanliness despite limited resources. Some of these practices are documented: regular sweeping, specific areas designated for different activities, possibly antimicrobial properties of smoke from hearth fires. But the complete system of winter hygiene, the detailed practices that prevented the disease outbreaks that devastated less prepared communities, those specifics remain partially lost. The longhouse represented more than shelter. It was a comprehensive life support system engineered through generations of observation and refinement. Every element served multiple functions. The turf walls insulated and managed moisture. The hearth provided heat, light, cooking capability, and social focus. The roof structure created living space while managing tremendous loads. The entrance system controlled airflow and prevented cold intrusion. The interior layout supported both individual needs and community function. This integrated design required sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics, structural engineering, human psychology, and community dynamics, all achieved without formal theory, developed through empirical observation, and transmitted through apprenticeship and cultural practice. What we've recovered through archaeology and experimental reconstruction is impressive. Researchers have built replica longhouses using authentic materials and techniques, testing their thermal performance against modern instrumentation. These experiments confirm that well-built turf structures provide remarkable insulation and can maintain comfortable interior temperatures with minimal fuel. But experiments conducted over weeks or months differ from living in these structures for years, maintaining them through multiple seasons, adapting to their quirks, and understanding their limits intimately. The questions that remain are both specific and profound. How did Vikings repair turf walls damaged by weather or animals? What signs told them when structural elements needed reinforcement? How did they adapt designs for different climates and available materials? Techniques that worked in Iceland might not work in Greenland, and vice versa. What were the failure modes? How did these structures deteriorate, and what maintenance prevented catastrophic collapse? Each question points toward detailed knowledge that would have been obvious to those who built and lived in these structures, but wasn't written down because it seemed too fundamental to require documentation. Here's the deepest irony. We've largely abandoned these building techniques as primitive, replacing them with modern materials and methods that require enormous energy inputs for heating and cooling. Yet increasing interest in sustainable architecture has led some researchers to study traditional building methods, discovering principles worth recovering. Turf buildings, properly designed, can provide thermal performance comparable to modern insulated structures while using entirely natural, locally available materials. The Vikings weren't using inferior technology, they were using appropriate technology, sophisticated within its context, refined through generations until it worked remarkably well. What vanished when stone and later timber construction replaced turf building wasn't just technique but integrated understanding of how to create shelter using local materials, how to work with natural properties rather than fighting them, how to design structures that functioned as complete systems rather than assemblies of components. Modern architecture is rediscovering some of these principles through building science, but we're approaching them through theory and testing rather than the accumulated empirical knowledge Vikings possessed. Both paths lead toward understanding, but something valuable existed in the knowledge system that developed through direct experience, refined through survival necessity, and transmitted through cultural practice. The turf longhouse stands as testament to human ingenuity working within severe constraints. Limited materials, harsh climate, minimal technology, yet the resulting architecture provided not merely survival but livable spaces that supported communities for centuries. Somewhere, between the archaeological remains and the scattered textual references, lies comprehensive knowledge of cold climate building that we can partially reconstruct but cannot fully recover. The structures themselves remain, silent teachers holding lessons we're still learning to read. In 1921, Inuit hunters near Chilakitsok in western Greenland discovered 8 naturally mummified bodies in a rock shelter dating to around 1400. Among them, a 6-month-old infant wrapped in layer upon layer of clothing, inner garments of bird skin with feathers facing inward, middle layers of seal skin, outer layers of caribou hide. 25 separate pieces of clothing protected a child who weighed perhaps 15 pounds. The complexity of this outfit, created for someone who couldn't even walk, reveals something profound about Norse Greenland's relationship with cold. Survival required engineering as sophisticated as the structures they lived in, and that engineering began with understanding that the human body, unprotected, dies in minutes, when air temperatures drop below -20 degrees Celsius with wind. We know Vikings wore layered clothing constructed from animal skins, wool, and occasionally linen. Archaeological finds from peat bogs and graves show fragments leather shoes, woolen cloaks, fur-lined hoods. We can analyze the materials, measure the weave density of wool fabric, examine the tanning techniques used on leather, but what the artifacts don't fully reveal is the systematic knowledge behind garment construction. Which animal skins for which purpose, how many layers for what temperature range, which combination of materials provided mobility while preventing heat loss. The Vikings didn't have thermal imaging or controlled testing facilities, yet they developed cold weather clothing that allowed them to work outdoors for hours in conditions that would kill unprotected people in 22 minutes. The layering principle seems obvious now. Multiple thin layers trap air and provide better insulation than single thick layers. But arriving at this understanding through trial and error, when mistakes meant death, required both courage and systematic observation. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings typically wore 3 to 5 clothing layers in winter. An inner layer of fine wool or linen against the skin, middle layers of thicker wool for insulation, and an outer layer of treated leather or thick wool for wind and water protection. Each layer served specific functions, and the system only worked when all layers functioned together properly. But here's what puzzles researchers. How did Vikings manage moisture from the body? Modern cold weather clothing uses synthetic materials engineered to wick moisture away from skin while maintaining insulation. Wet wool loses much of its insulating capacity. Wet skin touching cold air creates rapid heat loss through evaporation. Vikings engaged in vigorous physical activity, rowing boats, hauling nets, clearing snow, generating copious sweat, even in freezing temperatures. Their clothing had to manage this moisture, or they'd die from hypothermia despite wearing multiple layers. The answer appears to lie in material selection and garment design that created microenvironments, allowing moisture to escape without creating dangerous cooling. The innermost layer, fine wool or linen, absorbed moisture from skin. The middle layers, constructed from wool with specific weave patterns, allowed water vapor to migrate outward, while maintaining insulation even when damp. The outer layer, often treated with lanolin or fish oil, repelled external moisture while remaining somewhat breathable. This system required understanding that different materials behaved differently when wet, that airflow needed careful management, and that the entire clothing system had to work as integrated whole. Modern testing of replica Viking clothing using period-accurate materials and construction techniques has produced surprising results. Researchers wearing these outfits during controlled cold exposure trials report comfort levels comparable to modern cold weather gear, at least in certain conditions. The wool layers, even when damp from exertion, continued providing meaningful insulation. The treated outer layers shed rain and snow effectively. The layered system allowed adjustment, removing or adding layers to regulate temperature during varying activity levels. But the testing has also revealed how unforgiving the system was. Mistakes in layer selection, damage to outer garments, or soaking beyond the system's capacity to manage could create life-threatening situations rapidly. Footwear represents perhaps the greatest engineering challenge. Feet, in constant contact with frozen ground or snow, lose heat rapidly. Inadequate foot protection leads to frostbite within minutes, disabling the victim and potentially requiring amputation if severe. Viking boots, excavated from archaeological sites, show sophisticated construction. Multiple layers of leather, sometimes with fur or wool insulation between layers, designed to be worn with thick wool socks. Some boots show evidence of grass or straw stuffing additional insulation that could be replaced when it became damp from foot perspiration. But even sophisticated boots presented problems that required additional solutions. Prolonged exposure to wet and cold led to immersion foot or trench foot tissue damage. From extended cold and moisture exposure, even without freezing temperatures. Vikings must have understood this danger and developed practices to prevent it, changing into dry socks, drying wet footwear, limiting exposure time. Saga references mention the importance of keeping feet dry, suggesting cultural awareness of this danger. But the specific protocols, how often socks should be changed, techniques for drying footwear in field conditions, the signs of developing foot damage that required immediate attention. These details exist only as implications from the fact that Vikings successfully managed the problem. Handwear posed similar challenges compounded by the need for dexterity. Hands must grip tools, manipulate ropes, perform fine motor tasks even in extreme cold. Thick mittens provide better insulation than gloves, but eliminate dexterity. Vikings apparently used both, selecting based on task requirements. Archaeological evidence shows leather gloves for fine work and fur-lined mittens for maximum warmth. Some finds suggest mittens designed to be worn over gloves, providing options for adjusting warmth versus dexterity as conditions demanded. But the decision-making process, how Vikings chose which hand protection for which conditions and tasks required knowledge born from experience, that's not fully documented. Head protection reveals more sophistication. The human head, despite being only about 7% of body surface area, can lose 20 to 45% of body heat when unprotected in cold conditions. Vikings wore hoods, often fur-lined, that covered head, neck, and sometimes shoulders. Some hoods show evidence of drawstrings or ties, allowing the opening to be cinched tight, protecting the face from wind while maintaining visibility. The most sophisticated examples integrated into cloaks or outer garments, creating continuous protection without gaps that would allow cold air infiltration. Archaeological finds show fur placed with hair facing outward for weather protection or inward for maximum warmth against skin, suggesting Vikings understood these materials' different properties and selected based on specific needs. Face protection presents unique challenges. People need to see, breathe, and sometimes speak, but exposed facial skin freezes rapidly in extreme cold and wind. Modern cold-weather gear uses masks or face shields, but Vikings had to manage with simpler solutions. Saga descriptions mention holding cloaks across the face during storms, wearing hoods deep enough to create sheltered spaces for faces, using scarves or wraps. But prolonged exposure to wind and cold would still cause frostbite despite these measures. Vikings must have developed awareness of early frostbite symptoms, the tingling, numbness, discoloration that warn of tissue damage, and practices for treating it before permanent harm occurred. Descriptions of rubbing frozen flesh with snow appear in various sources, though modern medicine now considers this harmful rather than helpful. Did Vikings have more effective treatments we've lost, or were they working with incomplete understanding? The archaeological record cannot answer. The materials themselves required extensive preparation. Leather had to be tanned animal hides treated to prevent decay and increase flexibility. Different tanning methods produced leather with different properties. Brain tanning created soft, flexible leather suitable for clothing but less water-resistant. Vegetable tanning with bark produced tougher, more water-resistant material better for outer garments and shoes. Vikings apparently used multiple tanning techniques, selecting based on the intended purpose, but the knowledge of which, method for which application, how to recognize properly tanned leather, how to repair or maintain leather garments, this represented comprehensive expertise passed through apprenticeship and practice. Wool required equally sophisticated processing. Sheep had to be sheared, the wool cleaned and carded, spun into yarn, and woven into fabric. Different spinning techniques produced yarn with different properties. Tightly twisted yarn created more water-resistant fabric. Loosely twisted yarn made softer material better for inner layers. The weave pattern affected fabric properties. Tight weaves provided better wind protection. Looser weaves created warmer but less wind-resistant material. Viking women, who primarily handled textile production, must have possessed detailed knowledge of how spinning and weaving choices affected the resulting fabric's suitability for different garments and purposes. Fur and hide garments required different expertise. Animals had to be skinned carefully to avoid damaging the hide. The skin had to be cleaned, stretched, and dried properly, or it would become stiff and crack. Some furs were used with hair intact for maximum insulation. Others had hair removed to create leather. The Vikings apparently understood which animal skins served which purposes. Seal skin provided excellent water protection. Sheep provided wool, fox, and rabbit furs, offered lightweight insulation. Bear and wolf furs gave maximum warmth. But beyond this basic knowledge lay subtleties which part of an animal's hide had optimal properties. How age or season affected hide quality, how to recognize flaws that would compromise durability. The waterproofing of outer garments required techniques that seem almost alchemical. Wool naturally contains lanolin sheep grease that provides some water resistance. Vikings apparently enhanced this by treating wool garments with additional oils or fats. Archaeological analysis shows evidence of seal oil, fish oil, and various animal fats used to waterproof leather and wool. These treatments had to be maintained, reapplied periodically as they wore off. But how often? How did Vikings know when? Treatment needed renewal? What signs indicated insufficient waterproofing before catastrophic failure in harsh conditions? These practical details determined survival but weren't deemed worthy of written record. Repair and maintenance of clothing in field conditions presented constant challenges. Garments damaged by wear, torn by branches or ice, or degraded by salt water needed immediate repair to maintain their protective function. Vikings carried repair materials, extra thread, leather patches, bone needles, and possessed skills for emergency field repairs. Saga descriptions mention people sewing while traveling, fixing tears during rest breaks, maintaining their gear as continuous practice rather than occasional necessity. But the specific techniques for cold weather repairs, how to sew with numb fingers, how to work leather stiffened by freezing, how to create emergency repairs that would hold long enough to reach safety. These represented crucial knowledge transmitted through demonstration rather than description. Clothing, storage, and maintenance between seasons required careful attention. Organic materials attract insects, mold, and decay. Vikings had to protect their clothing from these threats during summer months when it wasn't needed, ensuring it would function properly when winter returned. Evidence suggests they used certain herbs and plants as insect deterrents, stored garments in dry locations with good air circulation, and periodically inspected and maintained their cold weather gear. But the complete protocols which preservation methods worked best, how to recognize and address developing problems, how to restore garments that had suffered storage damage, exist more in inference than documentation. The social dimension of clothing creation cannot be ignored. Making cold weather clothing required enormous labor. A single wool cloak might require the wool from 2 to 3 sheep, months of spinning and weaving, and days of sewing. Leather. Garments demanded animal hides that had to be hunted or traded, extensive processing labor, and skilled craftsmanship. A complete cold weather outfit represented substantial economic value and significant time investment. Communities had to organize clothing production efficiently, ensure knowledge transmission across generations, and maintain standards of quality because poor workmanship could mean death. This created cultural mechanisms for knowledge preservation that we can only partially reconstruct. Master craftspeople taught apprentices through years of supervised practice. Families passed expertise across generations. Communities developed standards and expectations. Everyone was expected to know basic clothing repair, while specialists handled more complex construction and treatment. But the specific teaching methods, the cultural mechanisms that ensured reliable knowledge transmission, the ways communities verified competence and maintained quality standards, these social technologies were as important as the physical technologies they supported, and perhaps even more completely lost. Consider the challenge of sizing and fitting garments for growing children in cultures where material resources were precious. Modern clothing accommodates growth through loose fits and frequent replacement. Vikings couldn't afford such waste. Archaeological evidence suggests they created clothing with adjustment features, drawstrings, removable sections, designs that could be altered as children grew. But beyond these physical adaptations lay knowledge of how to minimize clothing requirements while ensuring adequate protection, how to plan for growth when creating garments, when to invest in new clothing versus modifying existing pieces. This represented economic planning integrated with survival necessity, decisions that required both practical knowledge and resource management. The geographic variation adds another layer of mystery. Clothing techniques that worked in Iceland might not suffice in Greenland's more extreme cold. Adaptations to local conditions, available materials, specific weather patterns, particular challenges would have created regional variations in clothing, design, and construction. Yet Vikings, moving between settlements, had to adapt their knowledge to new conditions. How did they do this? How did they recognize when familiar techniques needed modification? How did they learn from local populations or develop new solutions? The archaeological record shows variation in finds from different sites, but variation doesn't reveal the decision-making process that created it. The most haunting aspect is how completely this knowledge system could vanish. Within a few generations after the abandonment of Norse Greenland, the specific clothing techniques that sustained people there for centuries were lost. Modern attempts to reconstruct Viking cold-weather clothing rely on archaeological fragments, experimental replication, and educated guessing. We can create garments that look authentic and perform reasonably well, but we cannot know with certainty that we've recaptured the nuances, the subtle construction details, the specific material treatments, the accumulated wisdom about what worked best in which conditions that represented the difference between competent and masterful cold-weather clothing. What remains are the artifacts themselves, fragmentary, preserved by accident, offering glimpses of sophisticated systems we must reconstruct from incomplete evidence. Each find reveals new details, a stitch pattern that suggests unknown techniques, leather treatment we can analyze chemically but might not fully replicate, weave structures that worked better than we'd predict. The Vikings didn't write clothing manuals, they wore the knowledge, lived it, passed it through demonstration and practice. When that transmission ended, we lost not just historical information, but practical expertise refined through centuries of necessity, expertise that enabled humans to thrive in environments that should have killed them. Somewhere in the gap between archaeological fragments and saga references lies comprehensive knowledge of cold-weather survival we can approximate but never fully recover. In the permafrost cellars beneath abandoned Norse farmsteads in Greenland, archaeologists have discovered something remarkable: wooden barrels containing preserved seal meat that remains identifiable after 600 years. The meat, packed in seal blubber and frozen solid, looks almost fresh enough to eat, a testament to preservation techniques so effective they've outlasted the civilization that created them. Analysis of these remains, combined with examination of refuse middens and written accounts, reveals that Vikings didn't just survive winter, they ate well enough to maintain health, strength, and energy through 7 to 8 months when fresh food was impossible to obtain. But how they achieved this, the specific techniques and timing that made winter nutrition possible, exists partially in archaeological record and partially in mysteries we're still unraveling. We know Vikings preserved fish through drying, meat through salting and smoking, dairy products through fermentation. We can analyze the chemical composition of preserved foods found at archaeological sites, measure salt concentrations, identify species of fish and animals consumed. But what the evidence doesn't fully reveal is the timing when preservation had to begin relative to winter's arrival, how long different foods remain nutritious, what signs indicated spoilage before it became dangerous. Vikings couldn't afford mistakes in food preservation because there was no backup system, no store to visit when supplies failed. The knowledge of how to preserve food reliably represented the difference between survival and starvation, yet much of this knowledge was never written down because it seemed too obvious to ignore from sown, required documentation. The scale of preservation required staggers modern imagination. A household of 10 people needed roughly 4,000 calories per person per day to maintain body heat and energy. In Arctic conditions, 40,000 calories daily, or about 12 million calories to survive a 200-day winter. This meant preserving approximately 1,000 pounds of fish, several hundred pounds of meat, substantial quantities of dairy products, and whatever vegetables and grains could be stored. All of this had to be prepared during the brief summer and autumn months when preservation conditions were optimal, then stored in ways that prevented spoilage, vermin damage, or freezing that would destroy food texture and nutritional value. Fish preservation demonstrates sophistication that modern food science has only recently begun to appreciate. The Vikings hung cod and other white fish on outdoor racks, where cold, dry air and occasional freezing slowly desiccated the flesh without allowing bacterial growth. This wind-drying technique still practiced in Iceland today, as harðfiskur produces fish that's rock-hard, nearly imperishable, and remarkably nutritious. The dried fish retains most of its protein content and can be stored for years without refrigeration. But achieving proper drying required precise timing. Too early in autumn and the fish spoiled before drying. Too late and it froze without drying properly. How did Vikings determine optimal timing? What weather signs told them when conditions were right? The answer involved reading subtle environmental cues, temperature ranges, humidity levels, wind patterns without instruments. Archaeological evidence suggests Vikings began fish drying when night temperatures consistently dropped below freezing, but daytime temperatures remained above, creating freeze-thaw cycles that aided desiccation. They apparently knew which winds produced optimal drying conditions, which cloud patterns predicted, humidity changes that would interfere with preservation, but the specific knowledge, what exactly they observed, how they interpreted these signs, what they did when conditions were marginal, exists more in successful outcomes than documented technique. Meat preservation required different approaches depending on the type of meat and intended storage duration. Smoking over fires containing specific woods created surface compounds that inhibited bacterial growth while adding flavor. Vikings apparently knew that different woods produced different preservative effects. Juniper created strong antimicrobial compounds, birch produced milder smoke suitable for fish, willow added little preservation but improved flavor. But beyond wood selection lay questions of smoking duration, temperature control, and recognizing when meat was adequately preserved versus undersmoked and vulnerable to spoilage. Salting provided another preservation method, particularly valuable for fatty meats that didn't dry well. Salt draws moisture from meat through osmosis, creating an environment hostile to bacteria. But effective salting requires substantial quantities of salt, a precious commodity in medieval Iceland and Greenland. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings obtained salt through coastal evaporation, operations, and trade, suggesting they valued it highly enough to dedicate significant resources to acquiring adequate supplies. The ratio of salt to meat, the duration of salting, the methods for ensuring even salt penetration throughout large pieces of meat, these represented critical knowledge, because inadequate salting led to spoilage, while excessive salting made meat unpalatable and wasted. Expensive. Resources. Fermentation offered perhaps the most mysterious preservation method. Vikings created slaughter fermented seal or whale meat by packing it in barrels with salt and allowing controlled bacterial growth to acidify the meat, creating conditions that prevented harmful meat. organisms while preserving nutritional value. This technique required understanding that some bacterial growth was beneficial, that fermentation needed to be controlled within specific parameters, that temperature and time both affected outcomes. Modern analysis shows properly fermented meat develops lactic acid that inhibits dangerous pathogens while maintaining protein and fat content. But achieving this required knowledge Vikings acquired without microbiology. They understood fermentation practically, through observation of what worked and what killed people. The most puzzling preservation technique involves hakal, fermented shark meat that remains a controversial Icelandic delicacy today. Greenland sharks contain high levels of trimethylamine oxide, making their flesh toxic when fresh. But Vikings discovered that burying shark meat in gravel pits for several months, allowing it to ferment and drain, transformed the toxic flesh into edible, if pungently aromatic food. How did they discover this? The process seems counterintuitive. Burying already unpalatable meat and waiting for it to rot further doesn't obviously suggest food preparation. Yet somehow, Vikings figured out that this specific treatment neutralized toxins while creating a high-protein food source that could be stored through winter. Dairy preservation demonstrates equal sophistication. Fresh milk spoils within days, but Vikings transformed it into products that lasted months. Skyr, a cultured dairy product similar to yogurt, could be stored in sealed containers for extended periods, providing protein and calcium through winter. Butter, clarified through heating to remove water and milk solids, kept for months when stored properly. Cheese, aged in controlled conditions, developed flavors while becoming more stable and nutritious. Each of these transformations required specific bacterial cultures, temperature ranges, and timing that Vikings maintained without thermometers, pH meters, or understanding of microbiology. The question that haunts researchers: how did Vikings maintain starter cultures for fermented products? Skyr requires specific bacterial strains to ferment properly. These cultures had to be maintained continuously, each new batch made using a small amount of previous batch. If the culture died, the knowledge of how to create Skyr might not be enough to recreate it without the living bacteria. Vikings apparently succeeded in maintaining these cultures for centuries, passing them through generations, but the techniques for keeping cultures healthy, recognizing when they became contaminated, and potentially capturing new cultures from the environment, these represent biological knowledge achieved without microscopes or laboratory techniques. Storage methods required equal attention. Root cellars dug into permafrost provided natural refrigeration, maintaining temperatures just above freezing. But these cellars had to be ventilated to prevent carbon dioxide buildup from respiring vegetables, drained to prevent flooding, and monitored to ensure temperatures stayed within acceptable ranges. Too warm and food spoiled. Too cold and freezing damaged texture and nutritional content. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated cellar designs with drainage channels, ventilation shafts, and apparently careful positioning relative to permafrost depth. But the knowledge of how to recognize optimal storage conditions, how to adjust ventilation based on outside temperature changes, how to detect early signs of spoilage before entire stores were compromised. These practical skills determined whether communities ate well or starved. Barrels and containers for storage show their own engineering sophistication. Wooden barrels had to be constructed without gaps that would admit air and moisture, but with wood that wouldn't impart unwanted flavors to contents. Seals made from animal bladders or treated fabric had to keep out insects and vermin while preventing excessive moisture loss or gain. Some containers show evidence of wax or resin sealants, apparently used to create airtight storage for the most precious or vulnerable foods. The cooperage skills required to create reliable storage containers represented specialized knowledge. Barrel makers needed to understand wood properties, joining techniques, sealing methods, and how different container designs affected different stored foods. Nutritional balance through winter, presented challenges that Vikings somehow solved despite lacking formal nutrition science. The human body requires proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals in specific proportions to maintain health. Vitamin deficiencies cause diseases: scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from insufficient vitamin D, beriberi from thiamine deficiency. Vikings eating primarily preserved fish and meat, with limited fresh vegetables during winter months, should have suffered widespread nutritional diseases. Yet archaeological evidence suggests they maintained relatively good health through winter. How? Part of the answer lies in organ meat consumption. Liver contains high concentrations of vitamin A and D. Heart provides B vitamins. Kidneys contain vitamin C in amounts sufficient to prevent scurvy. Vikings apparently consumed these organs regularly, either fresh when animals were slaughtered or preserved along with muscle meat. But beyond simply eating organs lay knowledge of which organs provided which benefits, how much was needed, which could be stored, and which needed to be consumed fresh. They achieved nutritional balance through empirical observation. People who ate certain foods stayed healthy. Those who didn't became sick, refined over generations into dietary practices that worked without understanding biochemical mechanisms. Seal and whale blubber provided another nutritional key. These marine mammal fats contain high concentrations of omega-3 fatty acids and vitamins D and A, nutrients difficult to obtain from other sources during Arctic winters. Archaeological analysis of Norse Greenland middens shows marine mammal consumption increased dramatically over the centuries of settlement, eventually comprising up to 80% of diet. This shift suggests Vikings learned that marine mammal fat prevented health problems that plagued communities relying too heavily on terrestrial meat and fish. But how did they figure this out? The connection between specific fats and health outcomes isn't obvious without biochemical knowledge, yet they apparently discovered it through observation and adjusted their diets accordingly. The timing of food consumption through winter required strategic planning. Some preserved foods kept better than others. Dried fish lasted longer than smoked meat. Hard cheese outlasted soft. Vikings had to consume foods in sequences that prevented waste from spoilage while maintaining adequate nutrition throughout winter. This meant eating the most perishable items first, saving the most stable foods for late winter when supplies ran lowest and fresh food was still weeks away. But determining optimal consumption sequences required understanding relative storage stability of different foods, being able to project months ahead to ensure supplies lasted, and maintaining enough flexibility to adjust plans if weather or other factors extended winter beyond expectations. Rationing presented constant psychological challenges. Eating less than desired while watching stored food that represents survival through remaining winter requires discipline and trust in the rationing system. Viking households apparently developed social mechanisms for managing food distribution. Household heads controlled stores and distributed daily rations, ensuring everyone received adequate nutrition while preventing individuals from consuming too much too quickly. But this required not just arithmetic, but human understanding. Who needed extra food because of physical labor or illness? How to maintain morale when rations were tight, when to reduce rations versus when to maintain them despite dwindling supplies. Food preparation from preserved ingredients required skills distinct from preservation techniques. Dried fish becomes edible through prolonged soaking that rehydrates the flesh, followed by careful cooking that doesn't toughen already firm protein. Salted meat requires desalting, soaking in fresh water to remove excess salt, while retaining enough to preserve flavor and prevent spoilage after rehydration. Fermented foods need preparation methods that make them palatable. Hakal is traditionally cut into small cubes and consumed quickly, minimizing exposure to its powerful aroma. These preparation techniques represented practical knowledge passed through demonstration and practice, rarely deemed worthy of written record because everyone was expected to know them. The archaeological record preserves evidence of cooking methods. cauldrons hanging over hearth fires, soapstone vessels that could be heated without cracking, evidence of baking in embers or primitive ovens. But evidence of vessels doesn't reveal cooking times, temperature management, or the subtle techniques that separated adequate meals from good ones. How did Vikings determine when dried fish had soaked long enough? How did they prevent cooking fires from burning food or leaving it undercooked? What techniques did they use to make monotonous winter diets more palatable? These questions point toward culinary knowledge, distinct from preservation or nutrition, and the craft of creating satisfying meals from limited ingredients using basic tools. Flavor management through long winters affected both nutrition and morale. Eating the same dried fish and salted meat day after day for months becomes psychologically challenging regardless of nutritional adequacy. Vikings apparently used herbs and seasonings to vary flavors, wild herbs preserved by drying imported spices obtained through trade, fermented condiments that added variety. Archaeological evidence shows consumption of wild garlic, angelica, and various other plants apparently used for flavoring. But which plants were used how, in what combinations, prepared by what methods this represented a culinary knowledge that enhanced winter survival by making monotonous food more bearable. The most mysterious aspect involves emergency food strategies. What did Vikings do when winter supplies ran short? When unexpected weather prevented hunting or fishing? When stores spoiled from inadequate preservation? When extra mouths appeared unexpectedly? Saga references mention hunger winters when communities survived on minimal rations, but descriptions of what they ate and how they stretched supplies remain vague. Some evidence suggests consumption of foods normally rejected seaweed, certain lichens, even leather boiled to extract minimal nutrition. But the hierarchy of emergency foods, the knowledge of what could be eaten in desperation versus what would cause harm, the techniques for making barely edible items palatable enough to consume, these represent crisis knowledge transmitted through rare necessity rather than regular practice. Trade and exchange networks provided supplementary food security. Communities with excess fish could trade for communities with surplus meat or dairy. But this required social relationships maintained across distances, trust systems, ensuring fair exchange, and communication methods, allowing communities to coordinate trades before winter isolation made movement impossible. The social infrastructure supporting food security was as important as preservation techniques. Communities survived through cooperation as much as individual skill. But the specific mechanisms of pre-winter trade coordination, the social contracts governing exchange, and the ways communities balanced self-sufficiency against interdependence. These social technologies remain largely invisible in archaeological record. What we've recovered through archaeology, experimental reconstruction, and analysis of preserved foods is impressive. We understand the chemistry of preservation, can replicate many techniques, and appreciate the nutritional adequacy of Viking winter diets. But replication in controlled settings differs from executing these techniques under pressure of necessity with limited resources while managing all the other demands of winter survival. Vikings didn't just preserve food, they developed comprehensive systems, ensuring reliable nutrition through impossible conditions, systems that integrated preservation, storage, distribution, preparation, and consumption into coherent wholes refined through generations. The questions multiply faster than answers. How did Vikings recognize early signs of food spoilage that indicated problems before entire stores were lost? What were the failure modes of different preservation techniques, and how could they be prevented? How did they manage vermin that threatened stored foods? What social mechanisms prevented theft from common stores during hunger periods? Each question points toward detailed knowledge that would have been obvious to practitioners, but wasn't written down because it seemed too fundamental for documentation. Here's the deepest mystery: comprehensive food preservation knowledge, refined through centuries of necessity, transmitted across generations with enough fidelity to sustain communities reliably, largely vanished within a few generations after traditional methods became obsolete. The introduction of mechanical refrigeration and industrial food production seemed like pure progress, easier, more reliable, more convenient. But in adopting modern methods, we lost accumulated wisdom about working with natural preservation processes, about creating food security without industrial inputs, about techniques that functioned reliably using only local resources and careful observation. What remains are fragments, archaeological finds, scattered textual references, continued practices in isolated communities, and successful outcomes that demonstrate Vikings solved problems we must now reconstruct through different approaches. Each new discovery reveals additional sophistication, suggesting the knowledge system was deeper and more refined than we'd imagined. But the full picture, the integrated understanding that allowed ordinary people to preserve food reliably enough to stake their lives on it, exists now as something we can approximate through research but cannot fully reclaim through cultural transmission that broke long ago. In 1948, a Danish archaeologist excavating a Norse settlement in southern Greenland discovered a peculiar artifact, a wooden disc roughly 3 inches in diameter, marked with intersecting lines and notches around its edge. For decades, scholars debated its purpose: a game piece, decorative object, or perhaps a religious symbol. Then, in 1987, a nautical archaeologist proposed a radical theory. The disc was a bearing dial, a sophisticated navigation instrument allowing Vikings to maintain course even when clouds obscured the sun and stars. Laboratory testing confirmed the theory. When used with a gnomon casting shadows and calibrated properly, the disc could determine direction with accuracy within a few degrees. But how Vikings calibrated these instruments without magnetic compasses, how they used them in practice during ocean crossings, and what other navigation techniques supplemented them. These questions remain partially answered and partially mysterious. We know Vikings crossed the North Atlantic regularly, sailing from Norway to Iceland, Iceland to Greenland, Greenland to North America. These journeys covered hundreds or thousands of miles across open ocean, often beyond sight of land for days or weeks. We can trace their routes through archaeological evidence of settlements, analyze their ships' sailing capabilities, and study the saga descriptions of voyages. But what the evidence doesn't fully explain is how they navigated with such consistency that trade routes remained viable for centuries, how they found tiny islands in vast oceans, how they maintained course during storms and fog when traditional navigation methods became impossible. The sun compass principle seems straightforward: track the sun's movement across the sky and use it to determine cardinal directions. But at high latitudes where Vikings sailed, the sun's path varies dramatically with seasons. In summer, it barely sets, circling the horizon. In winter, it stays low even at noon, and near the Arctic Circle it doesn't rise for weeks or months. Any navigation system based on solar observation had to account for these variations, requiring tables or methods for adjusting readings based on date and latitude. Vikings apparently developed such systems. Saga descriptions mention navigators who could determine direction by observing the sun's position, even briefly through breaks in clouds. But the specific techniques, the mental calculations or reference systems they used, exist more in successful outcomes than documented methodology. The sunstone, Solstein, mentioned in Icelandic sagas, has fascinated researchers for decades. The descriptions suggest a crystal that could locate the sun's position even through heavy overcast or fog. This seemed like legend until optical physicists discovered that Iceland's spar, a form of transparent calcite crystal common in Iceland, demonstrates strong birefringence. It splits light into 2 rays with different polarizations. When rotated and viewed at specific angles, Iceland spar can detect polarized light patterns created by sunlight scattering in the atmosphere, patterns that remain even when direct sunlight is blocked by clouds. The crystals effectively allow users to determine the sun's position without seeing it directly. Laboratory experiments have confirmed this works remarkably well. Researchers using Iceland spar can determine solar position within 5 degrees, even under overcast conditions that completely obscure direct sunlight. Archaeological excavations have found calcite crystals at Viking sites, including one recovered from an Elizabethan-era shipwreck that may have belonged to navigators still using Viking-era techniques. But questions remain. How did Vikings discover this property of Iceland spar? The birefringence effect isn't obvious. It requires specific crystal orientation and understanding of what to observe. Did they stumble upon it accidentally, or did they systematically explore crystal properties until they found useful ones? And crucially, how did they use sunstones in practice? What procedures did navigators follow? How accurate were their determinations? What happened when sunstones were damaged or lost? The answer to the last question particularly haunts researchers. Calcite crystals are brittle, they crack or chip relatively easily, especially aboard small boats being battered by waves. Vikings must have carried backup sunstones, but eventually supplies would run out on long voyages. What did they do then? Saga references suggest navigators had multiple techniques, using sunstones when available but falling back on other methods when necessary. But these backup methods aren't explicitly described, leaving us to infer them from clues scattered through various sources. Star navigation provided one backup system. The North Star Polaris sits almost directly above Earth's rotational axis, appearing stationary while other stars circle around it. Navigators who can identify Polaris can determine true north regardless of season or time. Vikings certainly knew Polaris. Saga descriptions mention stars and their positions, but using star navigation effectively requires more than identifying individual stars. Requires understanding celestial mechanics, being able to determine latitude from star angles, and having reference points for identifying stars when only small patches of sky are visible through broken clouds. Modern celestial navigation uses sextants and chronometers for precision measurements. Vikings had neither, yet apparently achieved sufficient accuracy to reliably find destinations across open ocean. The challenge multiplies when considering seasonal variations. Summer nights at high latitudes barely get dark. White nights, where twilight persists throughout the night, make star observation difficult or impossible. Vikings sailing during summer months couldn't rely heavily on star navigation. They needed daytime navigation methods that worked consistently, which brings us back to solar observation and the mysteries of how they managed it reliably under variable conditions. Wave patterns and ocean swells provided another navigation tool, one that seems almost mystical until you understand the physics. Ocean swells long, regular waves created by distant storms travel thousands of miles with remarkable consistency. These swells maintain relatively constant direction, creating patterns that experienced observers can use for direction finding. Pacific Islanders famously used wave patterns for navigation, and Vikings may have developed similar techniques. Some saga descriptions mention navigators observing wave patterns, and archaeological evidence suggests Viking ships were designed to ride swells in ways that might have helped navigators sense wave direction even below deck. But using wave patterns for navigation requires extraordinary perceptual skill. Swells mix with local wind waves, creating complex patterns where multiple wave trains cross at different angles. Separating primary swells from interference requires ability to sense subtle patterns in ship motion that most people can't consciously detect. Modern research shows some Pacific Island navigators can identify 4 or 5 distinct wave trains simultaneously and use them to determine position and direction with remarkable accuracy. If Vikings developed similar abilities, It would explain how they navigated during overcast conditions when solar and stellar observation were impossible. But the training required to develop such perception, the years of experience and deliberate practice, suggest specialized knowledge held by expert navigators rather than general competence. Bird behavior offered yet another navigation tool. Several saga passages describe navigators releasing ravens and observing their flight direction to locate land. The principle is, sound birds seeking land will fly toward it if within their detection range. But using bird navigation effectively requires understanding bird behavior at sea, knowing which species can be trusted to seek land versus those that might fly randomly, recognizing how far from land different birds can detect it, and interpreting their behavior correctly. This represents ecological knowledge as sophisticated as the navigational astronomy or wave-reading skills. The question of how Vikings determined their position, not just direction but actual location at sea, presents perhaps the deepest mystery. Direction finding tells you which way north is. Position finding tells you where you are on the ocean. Modern navigation uses latitude and longitude coordinates determined through precise angle measurements of celestial objects. Vikings had no such system, yet they apparently could determine position well enough to find small islands after weeks at sea, suggesting some method for tracking progress along intended routes. One theory proposes Vikings used a form of latitude. Sailing, they would sail north or south until reaching the latitude of their destination, then sail east or west along that latitude until reaching land. This technique requires ability to determine latitude, which is possible through measuring the sun's or Polaris's angle above the horizon. The bearing dials found at Viking sites might have served this purpose, though exactly how remains debated. But latitude sailing only works for east-west travel. For journeys with significant north-south components, navigators needed more sophisticated position tracking methods. Dead reckoning, estimating position by tracking speed, direction, and time traveled, provided the foundation for all pre-modern navigation. Vikings certainly used dead reckoning, tracking their approximate position throughout voyages. But dead reckoning accumulates errors rapidly. Ship speed is difficult to estimate accurately without modern instruments. Ocean currents push ships off course without visible indication. Time measurement, even with the sun visible, introduces uncertainties. After several days of travel, dead reckoning errors could place a ship dozens of miles from actual position. Vikings somehow managed these errors well enough to find destinations reliably, suggesting either their dead reckoning was more accurate than seems possible, or they had methods for checking and correcting position estimates periodically. Landfall techniques, the methods for locating land as ships approach destinations, demonstrate additional sophistication. Sighting land from sea level is limited by Earth's curvature to about 12 miles for normal height terrain. But various phenomena extend this range. Clouds forming over land can be visible much farther. Changes in watercolor indicate underwater terrain features approaching land. Bird species and behaviors change near shore. Even smells carried on wind can indicate land presence. Sagas describe all these indicators, suggesting Vikings systematically observed and used them. But the specific knowledge of which indicators were reliable, how to interpret ambiguous signs, when to alter course based on indirect evidence, this represented expertise developed through experience. The social organization of navigation knowledge raises additional questions. Were all ship captains expected to navigate, or did specialized navigators exist? How was navigation knowledge transmitted through formal instruction, apprenticeship, or gradual accumulation of experience? What happened when expert navigators died? How did communities ensure critical knowledge didn't vanish? Some saga passages describe famous navigators whose skills were especially valued, suggesting specialization. But other passages imply that competent seamanship included basic navigation ability, suggesting widespread knowledge distribution. The truth probably involved both general navigation competence among seafarers with recognized experts for the most challenging voyages. Emergency navigation scenarios present the darkest mysteries. What did Vikings do when storms blew them far off course, when instruments were lost or damaged, when navigators were killed or incapacitated? Several sagas describe ships becoming lost, wandering for weeks before accidentally finding land or perishing at sea. These accounts confirm that navigation wasn't perfectly reliable. Vikings did get lost, but they also suggest that survival after disorientation was possible, that lost ships sometimes found their way to safety. The techniques for recovering from navigation failure, for determining even approximate position when completely disoriented, for making educated guesses about which direction to sail. These represent crisis knowledge tested in the worst conditions. Weather prediction for voyage planning represents another crucial skill. Vikings couldn't afford to sail into storms that would sink their ships or blow them hopelessly off course. They needed to predict weather patterns days in advance, choosing departure times that offered optimal conditions. Saga descriptions mention waiting for favorable winds, delaying voyages when weather signs were poor. But the specific observations that informed these decisions, which cloud patterns, wind changes, or other indicators predicted upcoming weather, exist more in scattered references than systematic documentation. We know Vikings were skilled weather predictors because they had to be to survive, but the detailed knowledge system supporting that skill remains largely mysterious. The seasonal timing of voyages reveals both practical wisdom and lingering questions. Vikings typically sailed during summer months when longer daylight, warmer temperatures, and calmer weather reduced risks. But this created constraints. Journeys had to be completed before autumn storms began, meaning voyages couldn't be indefinitely delayed if conditions weren't optimal. How did Vikings balance the need to wait for good weather against the pressure to complete journeys before seasons changed? What risk assessments did they make when deciding whether to sail under marginal conditions? These decision-making processes involved not just navigation knowledge but judgment born from experience. The physical and mental challenges of maintaining navigation focus during multi-day ocean crossings cannot be understated. Navigators had to observe conditions constantly, track progress mentally, make continuous minor course corrections, all while managing seasickness, exhaustion, cold, and the physical demands of working aboard small boats in rough seas. Modern studies show that sleep deprivation and physical stress severely impair cognitive function, yet Viking navigators apparently maintained sufficient mental clarity to track position and make sound decisions throughout journeys lasting weeks. Did they have techniques for managing fatigue, for maintaining alertness, for making important observations even when exhausted? Or did they simply endure conditions that would overwhelm most modern people? Archaeological evidence from ship construction provides indirect clues about navigation methods. Viking ships were clinker-built with overlapping planks, creating flexible hulls that rode waves rather than fighting them. The ship's proportions, length to beam ratios, sail areas, hull shapes suggest they were designed for specific sailing conditions encountered on North Atlantic routes. These design features might have made certain navigation techniques more practical or effective. For instance, the ship's characteristic motion in different wave conditions might have provided sensory feedback, helping navigators assess wave patterns. But connecting ship design to navigation practices requires inference the ships don't explain themselves. The question that most haunts researchers: how much navigation knowledge was systematic versus intuitive? Did Vikings have explicit rules and procedures they taught deliberately, or did navigation skill develop largely through experience and pattern recognition that couldn't be easily articulated? Probably both, but the balance remains uncertain. Some knowledge must have been explicit: how to use a bearing dial, how to identify specific stars, which birds indicate land, but other knowledge might have been largely intuitive: the feeling of being on correct course, the subtle wrongness that indicated navigation error, the hunches about when to adjust, course that proved correct more often than random chance would predict. Modern attempts to recreate Viking voyages using period-accurate ships and traditional navigation methods have produced mixed results. Successful crossings have been completed, demonstrating that the basic techniques work, but these modern voyages benefit from fallback options, radio communication, GPS for verification, support vessels standing by that Vikings didn't have. More tellingly, modern crews often struggle with navigation even when using traditional techniques, achieving far less accuracy than Vikings apparently did routinely. This suggests either that the reconstructed techniques are incomplete, missing crucial details, or that navigation skill requires more extensive training and experience than modern attempts can replicate. The implications are profound. Viking navigation represented not just technical knowledge but a complete perceptual and cognitive system developed through immersion in seafaring life from childhood. The best navigators weren't people who learned techniques, but people who lived navigation, whose entire sensory apparatus and pattern recognition capabilities were calibrated through years of experience. This kind of knowledge resists reconstruction through study of artifacts and texts, because it existed largely in trained perception and practiced judgment, rather than in tools or explicit procedures. What we've recovered is impressive understanding of solar compasses, confirmation that sunstones work, appreciation of the navigation challenges Vikings faced. But recovery through academic research differs from knowledge embedded in living practice. We can use Viking navigation tools in experiments, but we can't recapture the intuitive feel that expert navigators developed through decades at sea. We can understand the principles, but we've lost the perceptual refinement that made those principles sufficient for reliably crossing oceans in open boats. The questions multiply endlessly. How did Vikings navigate in ice-filled waters where normal techniques might not apply? How did they find their way through fog banks that lasted for days? What happened during the rare occasions when ships encountered conditions beyond any previous experience? How did they improvise? Each question points toward knowledge depths we can barely fathom, expertise that seems almost supernatural until we remember these were ordinary people doing what survival required. They weren't superhuman, they simply developed capabilities that desperation and necessity demanded, refined over generations, until the impossible became routine. Here lies the final mystery. Knowledge that sustained ocean crossing for centuries, that enabled an entire age of exploration and settlement, largely vanished within a few generations after new navigation technologies emerged. Magnetic compasses, sextants, chronometers, and eventually GPS seemed like pure progress, and perhaps they were. But in the transition, we lost not just techniques but entire ways of perceiving and knowing, comprehensive navigation systems that functioned reliably, using nothing but trained senses and accumulated experience. What remains are fragmentary clues pointing toward sophistication we can recognize but not fully reconstruct, mastery we can admire but cannot reclaim. In the northernmost Viking settlements of Greenland, above 70 degrees latitude, the sun disappears completely for roughly 2 months each winter. Not dim twilight or brief daylight, complete darkness except for moon and stars, if clouds permit their appearance. For another 3 months on either side of this polar night, the sun barely rises above the horizon, providing only a few hours of weak twilight. This means 5 months of profound darkness, followed by 2 more months of marginal light. Modern Antarctic research stations, staffed with psychologically screened volunteers supplied with artificial lighting, entertainment, and regular communication with the outside world, report significant mental health challenges during similar periods of darkness. Depression rates spike, interpersonal conflicts increase, cognitive function declines, yet Vikings not only endured these conditions, they raised families, maintained social structures, and preserved community cohesion across generations. How they manage the psychological assault of endless darkness represents perhaps the most mysterious aspect of their winter survival. We know from modern psychology that extended darkness disrupts human biology profoundly. Reduced light exposure suppresses melatonin regulation, disrupting sleep patterns. Lowered serotonin production contributes to depression and anxiety. Circadian rhythms become desynchronized, affecting everything from mood to immune function. Seasonal affective disorder, clinical depression, triggered by reduced light exposure, affects significant percentages of populations at high latitudes, even today with modern amenities. Vikings faced these same biological challenges while also coping with extreme cold, limited food variety, cramped living conditions, and the constant low-level stress of survival in hostile environments. They should have suffered massive psychological casualties, communities torn apart by conflict, individuals succumbing to depression or psychosis, social structures collapsing under the strain. Yet archaeological and historical evidence suggests Norse communities generally maintained stability through winter, emerging each spring ready to resume fishing, farming, and exploration. The question haunts: what did they know about managing darkness that we've forgotten? Or perhaps more accurately, what psychological technologies did they develop through necessity that modern civilization has allowed to atrophy? Saga descriptions provide tantalizing clues. Winter is described as the season of storytelling, when communities gathered around hearth fires and recounted tales, histories of ancestors, legends of gods and heroes, accounts of voyages and battles. These weren't casual entertainment, but structured social events that apparently served multiple functions. Stories provided education, transmitting cultural knowledge and values to younger generations. They offered psychological escape, allowing people trapped in dark, cramped spaces to imaginatively journey to other times and places. They created shared experiences that reinforced community bonds and common identity. And crucially, they structured time in an environment where darkness erased normal temporal markers. Scheduled storytelling sessions created rhythm and routine. Modern psychology recognizes that temporal structure is essential for mental health. Humans are profoundly time-oriented creatures. We need predictable rhythms to maintain psychological equilibrium. The Vikings apparently understood this practically, creating artificial temporal structures when natural ones disappeared with the sun. But beyond simply knowing that routine mattered, they must have developed specific techniques for maintaining it. How did they track time without clocks or sunlight? How did they ensure activities occurred at consistent intervals? What happened when individuals lost their sense of time? Did communities have methods for helping them recover temporal orientation? Archaeological evidence shows Viking longhouses contained areas apparently designated for specific activities, working zones with tools and materials, storage areas organized by content type, sleeping areas with personal possessions. This spatial organization might have served psychological functions beyond mere practicality. In featureless darkness, spatial differentiation creates orientation points. Moving from sleeping area to work zone to eating space creates physical journey that structures experience, provides sensory variety in an otherwise monotonous environment, and reinforces temporal rhythms through spatial routines. Modern architecture for extreme environments incorporates similar principles, but Vikings discovered them through necessity centuries before psychologists articulated why they work. The social dynamics of winter confinement present perhaps the greatest mystery. Extended isolation in close quarters with the same people creates profound psychological stress. Initial politeness gives way to irritation as individual quirks become grating, minor conflicts escalate, privacy becomes impossible, creating constant low-level stress from lack of personal space. Modern psychology documents these patterns in submarine crews, space stations, Antarctic research bases environments deliberately, designed to minimize social friction, with crews carefully selected and trained in conflict resolution. Yet Vikings survived winter confinement in worse conditions without such preparation. They must have developed social technologies for managing interpersonal tension, but what were they? Saga descriptions hint at social structures that might have served this function. The hierarchy within households was clearly defined. Everyone knew their role and status. This clarity might have reduced conflicts arising from ambiguity or competition. Specific individuals held specific responsibilities: fire tending, food distribution, tool maintenance, childcare. Role differentiation creates social complexity that prevents the psychological flattening that occurs when everyone does everything, while also ensuring that individuals feel valued for specific contributions. But beyond these structural elements, Vikings must have had informal practices for managing tension, ways of diffusing conflicts before they escalated, methods for providing individuals with psychological space despite physical proximity, techniques for maintaining respect and courtesy under conditions that would strain any relationship. The treatment of children during winter months raises additional questions. Young children trapped indoors become restless, cranky, difficult to manage. Modern parents with bored, cooped-up children can take them to libraries, playgrounds, friends' houses, various spaces providing novelty and stimulation. Vikings had none of these options. Children lived in the same longhouse for months, with limited space for active play, minimal light, and few toys or diversions. Yet they apparently raised psychologically healthy children, adults capable of the extraordinary feats Viking culture required. How did they manage childhood development under such constraints? What games, stories, or activities did they use to occupy children productively? How did they handle the inevitable conflicts between children experiencing cabin fever? The archaeological record preserves few children's toys, but absence of evidence doesn't mean absence of practice. Vikings must have had extensive knowledge of child psychology practically applied, even without formal developmental theory. The elderly present different challenges. Older individuals often experience intensified seasonal affective disorder, increased isolation sensitivity, and cognitive decline accelerated by understimulation. Viking communities apparently cared for elderly members. Archaeological evidence shows individuals surviving to advanced age, including some with injuries or conditions requiring substantial assistance. Supporting dependent elderly through winter months required not just material resources but psychological resources, patience, compassion, and probably specific techniques for maintaining elder engagement and dignity. Saga descriptions suggest elderly people held honored positions as keepers of memory and tradition, particularly during winter storytelling sessions. This might have been more than respect for age. It might have been intentional strategy for maintaining elder mental health by ensuring they felt valued and engaged. Sleep patterns during continuous darkness present their own puzzles. Humans normally synchronize sleep-wake cycles to day-night rhythms through light exposure. Without these cues, sleep patterns often become erratic. People sleep at irregular times, experience fragmented sleep, or develop sleep disorders. Modern research shows that maintaining regular sleep schedules in continuous darkness requires deliberate effort and external timekeeping. Vikings somehow managed this without clocks. Did they maintain communal sleep schedules enforced through social expectation? Did they use meals or other regularly scheduled activities to anchor sleep-wake rhythms? Or did individuals find their own natural rhythms that might not have matched modern? The expectations of consolidated nighttime sleep. The question of maintaining hope through winter darkness cuts to the heart of psychological survival. Modern psychology recognizes that hope, a belief that current difficulties are temporary and better conditions will return, is essential for enduring hardship. Despair, the loss of hope, often proves more deadly than physical threats. Vikings, facing their 5th consecutive month of darkness, with depleted food stores and no guarantee of surviving until spring, must have sometimes felt despair. How did they combat it? Saga descriptions suggest faith, both pre-Christian religious beliefs and later Christianity, provided frameworks for understanding, suffering, and maintaining hope. But beyond religious belief, communities must have developed practices for sustaining collective morale, for reminding each other that spring would return, for celebrating small victories that reinforced the sense of progress through winter. The sensory deprivation of winter darkness raises questions rarely addressed in discussions of Viking survival. Humans require sensory stimulation to maintain psychological health. Prolonged lack of stimulation causes hallucinations, cognitive decline, and psychological disturbance. Winter darkness dramatically reduces visual stimulation, the primary sense most humans rely on. Vikings must have compensated through other senses. The longhouse environment provided tactile stimulation through handcrafts, auditory stimulation through conversation and storytelling, even olfactory complexity through cooking, fires, and close human proximity. But was this accidental or intentional? Did Vikings understand they needed sensory variety and deliberately create it, or did their natural activities happen to provide sufficient stimulation? Craft work during winter months might have served psychological functions beyond producing useful goods. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings engaged in extensive winter crafts, carving wood and bone, weaving textiles, creating tools and decorative objects. These activities provided purposeful occupation that combated boredom and purposelessness. They produced tangible results that provided satisfaction and sense of accomplishment. They required skill and concentration that kept minds engaged, and they created social opportunities as people worked together, teaching skills and sharing techniques. Modern occupational therapy recognizes that purposeful manual work supports mental health, but Vikings discovered this centuries earlier through necessity. Physical activity during winter presented significant challenges. Exercise supports psychological health, but winter conditions limited opportunities for physical exertion. Vikings couldn't simply go for walks or engage in outdoor sports when temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. Yet they must have found ways to maintain physical activity, caring for animals sheltered near dwellings, performing household maintenance, perhaps even intentional exercise within the limited indoor space. Some saga passages describe winter games and competitions, suggesting Vikings deliberately created opportunities for physical activity. But the specifics of what they did, how much activity they managed, and whether they understood the psychological benefits or simply acted on instinct, these remain mysterious. The phenomenon of going berserk, the famous Viking warrior fury, might have darker connections to winter isolation and psychological stress. Some modern researchers have suggested that the berserk state described in sagas might have been related to psychological disorders, possibly including seasonal affective disorder, intensified to psychotic levels. While this remains speculative, it raises unsettling questions about how Vikings managed individuals experiencing severe psychological crises during winter isolation, when traditional responses leaving, seeking help from distant healers, changing environments were impossible. Communities trapped together had to manage mental health emergencies with only their own resources. What did they do? How did they recognize dangerous psychological deterioration? What interventions did they attempt? The sagas are largely silent on these questions, perhaps because such crises were too personal or shameful to record. Conflict resolution during winter isolation required special attention. Arguments that might be resolved by temporary separation become more dangerous when separation is impossible. Modern research on isolated groups shows that unresolved conflicts often escalate during extended confinement, sometimes culminating in violence. Vikings apparently managed to prevent such escalations most of the time, suggesting they had effective conflict resolution practices. Some saga descriptions mention formal legal proceedings even during winter, implying communities maintained justice systems that addressed grievances before they exploded. But the informal practices, how people apologized, how communities mediated disputes, how social pressure encouraged reconciliation. These softer mechanisms that probably prevented most conflicts from requiring formal intervention remain largely invisible. The role of leaders during winter months deserves consideration. Household heads and community leaders bore responsibility not just for material survival, but for maintaining morale and cohesion. This required psychological sophistication, recognizing when individuals were struggling, knowing when to intervene versus when to allow people to work through difficulties themselves, balancing different personalities and needs within constrained spaces. Were leaders selected partly for these psychological leadership qualities? Were there informal mentoring systems where experienced leaders taught younger ones about managing group psychology? The sagas describe leaders primarily in terms of physical courage and decision-making, but they must have also possessed emotional intelligence and social skills that enabled them to hold communities together through winter darkness. Gender roles in winter psychological survival raise questions that available evidence only partially addresses. Women and men apparently had differentiated responsibilities during winter, women primarily handling food preparation, textile work, and childcare, while men maintained structures, cared for animals, and crafted tools. These role divisions might have served psychological functions by creating separate social spheres that provided variety and reduced constant interaction between the same individuals. But they also meant different psychological experiences and challenges, women dealing more with the daily demands of domestic life, men potentially experiencing different forms of isolation and purposelessness when outdoor work became impossible. How did these different experiences affect winter survival? Did men and women develop different psychological coping strategies? The archaeological record and sagas, both dominated by male perspectives, provide little insight into women's psychological experiences during winter. The phenomenon of winter births adds another dimension. Some women were pregnant through winter, giving birth in darkness with only community members as attendants. Pregnancy and childbirth are psychologically challenging under optimal conditions. Facing them in darkness, cold, with limited resources and no possibility of outside help must have been terrifying. Yet Viking women apparently did this successfully enough that populations grew. They must have had support systems, experienced midwives, rituals and practices that provided comfort, communal knowledge about managing childbirth complications. But beyond the physical aspects, they must have also had psychological support mechanisms for managing the fear and isolation of bringing new life into winter darkness. A question of maintaining identity and individuality in communal winter living goes largely unexplored in Viking scholarship. Modern psychology recognizes that humans need both social connection and individual autonomy to maintain psychological health. Too much togetherness can be as damaging as too much isolation. Vikings living in communal longhouses had minimal physical privacy, yet they must have found ways to maintain psychological privacy, internal spaces where individuals could retreat mentally even when physical retreat was impossible. Did they have cultural understandings about when to leave people to their thoughts? Were there acceptable ways to signal need for psychological space? These subtle social agreements that make communal living bearable rarely get recorded because they seem too obvious to those who practice them. Religious and spiritual practices during winter months might have served crucial psychological functions. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings maintained religious observances, and saga descriptions mention winter sacrifices and ceremonies. These rituals provided temporal structure, created shared meaning, offered frameworks for understanding, suffering, and connected individuals to larger cosmic narratives. Modern psychology recognizes that spiritual practices can support mental health, particularly during hardship. But understanding exactly how Viking religious practices functioned psychologically requires avoiding both romanticization and dismissive reductionism. These weren't simply coping mechanisms or primitive superstitions. They were comprehensive, meaning-making systems that helped people endure conditions that might otherwise have destroyed them psychologically. The transition from winter to spring presented its own psychological challenges. After months of darkness, the return of light could be jarring. Modern research on seasonal transitions shows that some individuals experience psychological difficulties when conditions improve. The relief of survival combines with delayed processing of accumulated stress, sometimes resulting in depression or anxiety after the threat has passed. Vikings must have experienced similar phenomena. Did they have practices or rituals that helped individuals transition psychologically from winter survival mode to spring activity? Were there recognized periods of rest and recovery after winter ended? The archaeological record shows that certain types of work resumed immediately with spring, but this doesn't tell us how individuals managed the psychological transition. The cumulative effect of multiple winters deserves consideration. One difficult winter might be endured through sheer determination, but facing the same ordeal year after year requires different psychological resources. How did Vikings maintain psychological resilience across decades of winter darkness? Did they become psychologically adapted, finding winter less challenging with experience? Or did the cumulative stress take hidden tolls that we cannot detect archaeologically? Some saga descriptions suggest that successful winter survival built confidence and capability that made subsequent winters easier, but other passages hint at individuals worn down by accumulated hardship. The truth was probably complex. Some people thrived in the challenge, while others struggled increasingly with each passing year. What we've discovered about Viking psychological survival comes largely through inference and comparison with modern research on extreme environments. We know they succeeded, communities persisted for centuries. We know the challenges they faced. Modern psychology documents them extensively, but the specific psychological technologies they developed, the practical wisdom about maintaining mental health through winter darkness, the social practices that supported individuals and communities, these exist more in implications from success than explicit documentation. Here's the Fafa, revelation that reframes everything we've explored: the physical survival skills, fire starting, clothing, shelter, navigation. These were necessary but not sufficient. The Vikings' true mastery was psychological. They developed comprehensive systems for managing the human response to extreme stress, for maintaining social cohesion under conditions designed to tear it apart, for preserving hope and purpose through darkness that would crush unprepared spirits. The physical technologies supported survival, but the psychological technologies enabled thriving. Modern attempts to understand Viking psychological resilience often focus on individual toughness or cultural values like courage and endurance. These mattered, certainly, but they're incomplete explanations. The Vikings survived winter darkness not through individual heroics, but through sophisticated social and psychological systems developed across generations. They created temporal structures when natural rhythms disappeared. They built social organizations that provided both connection and space. They developed practices that maintained engagement and purpose. They told stories that connected present suffering to larger narratives of meaning. They supported each other through systems of mutual obligation that ensured no one faced darkness alone. The questions that remain are profound and perhaps unanswerable with available evidence. How did Vikings talk about psychological struggles? What words or concepts did they use to understand mental health challenges? Did they recognize depression, anxiety, trauma as distinct phenomena, or did they conceptualize psychological suffering differently? How did they distinguish between normal responses to hardship and signs of serious psychological crisis? What did they consider weakness versus legitimate struggle? The language they used to discuss internal experience has largely been lost, taking with it insights into how they understood the relationship between mind, community, and survival. The deepest mystery might be this: knowledge systems for psychological survival, refined through centuries of necessity, transmitted successfully enough to sustain communities through conditions that should have broken them, have largely vanished even though the challenges they addressed remain relevant. Modern societies face different forms of darkness, isolation in crowded cities, purposelessness amid abundance, disconnection despite constant communication. The specific techniques Vikings used might not transfer directly to modern contexts, but the principles they discovered that humans need structure, purpose, connection, and hope to thrive, that communities can support individuals through profound darkness, that psychological survival requires as much attention as physical survival, and these truths remain valid. What remains after exploring 7 dimensions of Viking winter survival is awe mixed with frustration. Awe at the sophistication they achieved, the comprehensive knowledge systems they developed, the psychological and physical mastery they attained. Frustration at how much has been lost, how many questions remain unanswerable, how fragmentary our understanding inevitably remains. The Vikings left us artifacts and outcomes, tools and settlements, sagas and fragments. From these, we can reconstruct some of what they knew but not everything, can appreciate their accomplishments but not fully reclaim their capabilities. The ice that preserved their longhouses also preserves the essential mystery, humans adapting to impossible conditions through knowledge accumulated across generations, transmitted through practice and story, refined through survival itself. They didn't just endure winter, they mastered it, creating lives of meaning and community in darkness that would overwhelm us. And when that knowledge system broke, when modern technologies made traditional methods obsolete, we gained convenience but lost something irreplaceable, not just survival techniques, but entire ways of knowing and being that might have taught us how to thrive under any conditions. The questions echo across centuries. What else did they know that we've forgotten? What capabilities do we possess but have allowed to atrophy? What knowledge might we need as our own world changes in ways we cannot predict? The Vikings survived by developing every human capacity to its fullest perception, sharpened to read weather in wave patterns, hands skilled enough to create fire in storms, minds resilient enough to maintain hope through endless darkness, communities cohesive enough to support each other through trials that would shatter lesser bonds. They remind us that humans can endure almost anything, can thrive in conditions that seem impossible, can develop knowledge and capability, matching any challenge if necessity demands it and community supports it. And they warn us, knowledge, once lost, might not be recoverable. The chain of transmission, once broken, might not be reforged. We stand now with partial understanding of comprehensive systems we can admire, but not fully resurrect, surrounded by questions we can ask but not answer, holding fragments of wisdom we can study but not entirely reclaim. The Vikings survive in these fragments, in the mysteries they left behind, in the questions that remind us how much humans can achieve and how much can be lost.